A parish register should have ended the mystery with ink and dates, yet the child's name moves each time the ledger is opened, as if the record itself refuses to settle. What happens when history rewrites itself in real time? The register lies on a shelf that has outlasted the church that kept it. Bound in calfskin, brittle at the edges, its pages are the only surviving trace of a parish that was once a scattering of cottages on the edge of the Welsh hills. On the page marked 1812, the handwriting is steady, a clerk's long hand, ink pressed deep into the fibers. The entry is ordinary until the eye falls on the column reserved for the father's name. Where most lines bear a single surname, here there are 5, each written in sequence, separated not by commas, but by faint ticks, as though each man stood in turn and gave his assent. The child's name is recorded, but the infant himself is reduced to a single line, male, christened on the 10th of June. What unsettles the reader is not the presence of 5 men, but the absence of correction. No cross marks, no overwriting. The clerk did not attempt to reconcile or erase. The ink remains unbroken, as if all 5 names belonged equally to the child. In the margin, a smaller hand has written just 2 words, all claimed. The script is sharper, hurried, unlike the deliberate penmanship of the main entry. It leans to the right, as though scrawled in haste before the ink dried. When parish registers are compared, the anomaly stands alone. Bastardy bonds were common in early 19th century Wales. Most illegitimate children were assigned a single putative father, or left blank. 5 names in one space had no precedent. The church had a clear vocabulary for scandal, natural issue, base-born, illegitimate. Yet none appear here. Instead, the entry is silent, clinical, and complete. Scholars who examined the ledger in the 1920s remarked on another detail, the ink itself. 4 of the 5 names are written in one tone, the familiar sepia that fades with decades. The 5th, though pressed by the same quill, remains darker, as though it had been inscribed later, or refused to age. Under angled light, the letter strokes gleam faintly, like graphite rubbed smooth. The parish that recorded the child would vanish within a generation. Fires destroyed the nave, cottages fell into ruin, and by mid-century the name of the village had been struck from county maps. But the register survived, stored in a diocesan archive, its pages oddly pristine. The baptism line remains legible in a way no other on that page does, as if the fibers themselves resisted decay. Archivists noted the strangeness, but filed it as a curiosity, a footnote in a volume otherwise filled with ordinary baptisms, marriages, and deaths. No witness signatures accompany the entry. Only the line of names, the margin note, and the silence between them. The infant's life, whatever it became, began in a single stroke of ink that refused to choose a father and instead preserved all 5, uncorrected, unchallenged, and waiting to be read again 2 centuries later. Beneath the column where the 5 fathers' names still sit in perfect sequence lies a mark that should not be there. At first glance it resembles the usual witness signature, a flourish where a clerk or parish officer confirmed the event. Yet when studied closely, the line falters into something strange. The strokes do not flow with the confident rhythm of practiced penmanship, but wobble upward, as if the hand that held the quill pushed against the grain of the paper instead of with it. Ink settles in irregular pools along the fibers, gathering where the pressure was too heavy, as though the page were resisting the inscription rather than receiving it. Archivists who examined the register in the 20th century found the signature almost impossible to attribute. No clerk of Glenfirth parish carried initials resembling the jagged scrawl, and no known parish officer used the looping cross that ends the mark. More disturbing was the directionality. Under magnification, the iron gall ink appeared to have been drawn from beneath the paper, bleeding upward through the fibers, instead of pressed down from above. The result is a name that seems to float in reverse, legible only when seen at certain angles. When early genealogists tried to compare the mark to other documents from the region, they discovered nothing. Local wills, tax receipts, and land deeds bore the familiar hands of county clerks, but none matched the cramped, leaning strokes of the witness beneath the baptism. One antiquarian, after weeks of study, noted that the signature did not diminish with exposure. Where most ink had browned and thinned, this line retained its density, as though it had been written the day before. The parish vestry minutes for June 1812 list no irregularity in baptisms, no visitors, no additional clergy. Yet the ledger shows this mark, indelible, without explanation. In later decades, when the parish itself ceased to exist, the archivists who transferred the records penciled a note beside the entry. Illegible, origin uncertain. They could not remove it. Attempts to scrape or wash the line only drove the pigment deeper into the page. The signature does not resolve into any known name. Some claim it resembles an H, others a G turned backwards. Under raking light, the lines seem to shift, pulling into new shapes depending on the angle of the lamp. It resists being read, as though its meaning depends not on language but on the act of looking. To this day, the entry remains a puzzle, an unseen hand that pressed its presence into the baptism record of a child already claimed by 5 fathers. A presence that should not exist and yet insists upon being remembered. The census of 1812 for Glenfirth Parish survives only in fragments, watermarked sheets bound into a folio now browned at the edges. In the neat columns where each household was meant to be tallied, 5 entries appear in a row, aligned like a procession. Each lists a male head, each separated by only a year or 2 in age, all in their mid-20s. The names are plain and unremarkable: Jones, Price, Llewellyn, Harris, Owen, names found across Wales in countless ledgers. What draws the eye is not their commonness, but their arrangement. Their cottages stood side by side along the same narrow lane, neighbors not by chance but by symmetry, as though placed deliberately at the edge of the parish boundary. Every household recorded a single man, no wife, no children, no lodgers. Occupation lines vary: one a mason, another a mill hand, one listed simply as laborer. Yet the hand that wrote those words is the same across all 5 lines, and the loop in the capital letters is identical to the one that signed the baptismal entry for the unclaimed infant. The placement feels rehearsed, as if these men were less individuals than iterations of a single record. Within 10 years, their presence dissolves. Tax rolls that should continue their names year after year suddenly replace them with empty fields, the spaces left conspicuously blank rather than reassigned to new tenants. Land assessment tables mark the parcels only as pending. When county officials reviewed the rolls in 1823, they noted the missing data but did not correct it. The blank fields were recopied faithfully into each subsequent record, the absence becoming its own entry. Local folklore, preserved in a handful of letters, speaks of the 5 brothers without kin, men who worked but never stayed, who were seen in the village but left no trace in its memory. One neighbor, writing decades later, recalled them walking together at dusk, their voices low, their shadows stretched in parallel across the stone road. No marriages, no graves, no wills have ever surfaced. By the 1830s, their surnames vanish entirely from Glenfirth deeds, as though erased not by neglect but by agreement. Archivists have long puzzled over the deliberate continuity of the blanks. In ledgers filled with corrections, strike-throughs, and marginal notes, only these 5 names disappear without amendment. The silence is as orderly as their arrival. 5 men recorded side by side, 5 households aligned, 5 surnames carried for a decade, and then swallowed whole, leaving only white space where identity should have been. In the record's quiet insistence, the blanks tell a story as loud as any name. The first ledger that names him does so only in the most general of terms: infant, no weeks, no months, no calculation of days. The word hangs in the baptismal register, a placeholder rather than a measure. For most children christened in the parish, the entry would later be shadowed by school rosters, attendance slips, notations of apprenticeship or taxation. This child leaves nothing. The paper trail goes quiet for more than half a century, as though the infant never grew, never stepped into the public record at all. When the silence finally breaks, it does so in a document meant to close a life. A burial ledger dated decades later records a body interred in unconsecrated soil on the outskirts of the parish. The name, if it was ever written, has been rubbed away by time, but the description in the column for age remains. Instead of a number, the clerk wrote a single word, unaged. The entry is stark against the page, without embellishment, but unlike other mistakes or omissions in the ledger, it was never corrected. In the margin, another hand, thinner and uncertain, added only, same as christened. Researchers who compared the two entries found more than coincidence. The ink strokes, though written decades apart, seem to mirror one another. The loop in the letter, G, of unaged, nearly identical to the loop in the F, of infant. Different words, different clerks, but the rhythm of the hand uncannily alike, as if the same influence guided both. The burial register does not provide a birth year, nor any calculation to estimate the span of life. The body recorded was male, slight, without distinguishing marks, but the column meant to fix his years instead suspended him outside of time. The absence of intermediate records is more unsettling than the burial itself. Parish schools compiled annual lists. Apprenticeships were logged with the county. Even the poor rates noted the smallest dependents. Yet from christening to grave there is no sign of him. No attendance, no occupation, no household census ever includes a child of that name or age. Archivists scanning the ledgers for anomalies describe the effect as a blank corridor. You enter through one door marked infant, and decades later emerge through another marked unaged, with nothing between. The parish officials who filed the burial left the page unbalanced. Where other entries are framed by dates, kin, or cause, this one stands alone, sealed only by the unsettling word that denies time itself. It is not that his years were hidden, but that no years were ever granted. He entered the record as infant, he departed as unaged, and between those two bookends the paper insists there was nothing to count. The notebook is a small, leather-bound volume held now in a medical archive, its pages filled with the cramped, hurried script of a country physician who served Glenfirth in the 1830s. Among the fever charts and accounts of broken bones is a passage that does not match the rest. It begins abruptly with a phrase underlined twice, the Glenfirth case. No further context is offered, as though the doctor assumed the phrase was already known to anyone who might read it. Beneath the heading lies a sketch, simple but precise, of a glass vial with a stopper and the faint outline of fluid rising halfway to the neck. Along its side he has written, sample drawn 5 lines, and below that, not separable. The accompanying notes attempt to describe what he observed. He claims the sample did not clot in the expected manner. When diluted with saline, it produced 5 distinct rings of sediment that would not mix or merge, no matter how often the vial was agitated. He writes that he attempted heating the sample, then cooling it, but the pattern held. 5 layers, faint but visible, as though belonging to 5 separate donors. In the margin, he scrawled a single word, unsortable. The letters are jagged, as if pressed harder than the rest of the text, ink bleeding into the grain of the paper. The physician does not state the child's name, only that the subject was small, quiet, and without resistance. His notes mention no illness, no complaint from family, no reason for the test except curiosity. One line suggests the boy was brought by guardians who feared defect, though no record identifies who those guardians were. After describing the strange behavior of the blood, the physician leaves a final observation. Not 1, not 5. Indistinct in property. The phrase lingers like an unfinished diagnosis refusing classification. When later medical historians examined the notebook, they were struck not only by the content but by the ink itself. The word unsortable remained darker than the surrounding notes, almost as if written years later, or by a different hand. Yet, analysis showed the same iron gall composition as the rest of the page. Some argued it was rewritten over the original, others claimed it had simply resisted the fading that touched the rest of the book. The physician never published his findings. No mention of the Glenfirth case appears in his official reports to county health boards, and his surviving patients' records contain nothing like it. But the notebook entry survived, a single page that suggests the boy carried in his veins not one heritage but five, inseparable, indissoluble, and forever beyond the categories medicine relied upon. In the silence after that page, the doctor never returned to the case again. The photograph was discovered folded between the pages of an estate inventory, its corners sharp, its surface free of the usual scratches that haunt images of its age. The card mount bore no studio mark, no embossed initials, only the faint metallic sheen of the tintype itself. In the image, a boy sits rigid on a straight-backed chair, his hands folded on his lap, his gaze directed just shy of the lens. Behind him hangs a patterned drape, a backdrop catalogued in advertisements from a London studio that closed its doors in 1868. No record exists of any photographer operating within the parish of Glenfirth, nor of any such studio travelling into the Welsh countryside that year. Yet the tintype is undeniably local, having been filed among household goods and farming receipts of a family who never left the valley. What troubles those who studied it is not only the subject but the condition. By the time it surfaced in the 1920s, most tintypes from the 1860s had dulled or spotted with rust along their surfaces. This one remained clear. The boy's eyes seemed to hold the same sharpness as the day they were taken. Chemical testing in the mid-20th century confirmed the anomaly. The emulsion showed no breakdown, the iron plate no oxidation. The photograph behaved as though immune to time. Comparisons with parish records suggest the child should have been more than 50 years old by 1867, if indeed he was the same infant christened in 1812 and later buried as unaged. Yet the boy in the picture appears no older than 9, his clothes plain but freshly pressed. His hair combed flat with the same severity seen in early institutional portraits. Even the small mole on his cheek corresponds with earlier descriptions in scattered notes. There is no growth, no aging. He looks unchanged, preserved in an era that should have carried him forward. The backdrop complicates matters further. The drape behind the chair was traced to a London studio known as Tolbert, Sons, whose advertising cards display the same curling floral motif. Their business never extended into Wales, and no client registry lists anyone from Glenfirth. Historians speculated the tintype must have been brought from London by someone travelling through, but no explanation accounts for how a boy without census or tax record could appear in that chair. The more the image was handled, the less it seemed to belong. Held under strong light, the silvered surface did not reflect but absorbed, darkening briefly before clearing again. One archivist described the sensation of being watched by the boy rather than looking at him. Another refused to catalogue the photo at all, insisting it was not a record but an intrusion. And yet it remains, crisp and unyielding, a photograph that should not exist, documenting a child who should have outlived the moment but never moved beyond it. In the year 1874, when disputes over land and inheritance reached their peak across the county, the probate court at Glenfirth recorded a series of wills that unsettled even its seasoned clerks. 5 separate testaments were filed within the span of 2 months, each belonging to a different man, each witnessed by different neighbors, yet all naming the same dependent as heir. The dependent's name is never given in full, only the terse designation, Ward of Glenfirth, as if the court already understood who was meant. What confounded the clerks was not only the overlap but the handwriting itself. Every document, though attributed to a different testator, bore the same loops in its letters, the same measured slope of the ink, the same faint hesitation at the end of each line. The men in question were all very much alive when the wills were drawn. Parish registers list them as present in census tallies, their names attached to modest parcels of farmland and small trades. None were wealthy enough to require elaborate wills, yet all felt compelled to write one in the same season, each claiming guardianship over the same silent child. In ordinary disputes of inheritance, the court would compare signatures, validate witnesses, and settle estates after death. Here, the problem arrived before anyone had died, and it carried the strange weight of replication. 5 men alive, 5 wills complete, and 1 child placed at the center as if tethered to each. The court clerk tasked with reconciling the entries left a note in the margin of the probate book. Identical hand. Yet 5 men swore to their mark. No correction possible. That note, still visible in faded graphite, was never expanded upon. When questioned years later, the clerk claimed to remember little beyond the discomfort of watching 5 neighbors sign documents that looked less like individual statements than rehearsals of a single script. Legal scholars reviewing the case in the 20th century remarked on the eerie consistency, even the errors repeated. In 2 of the wills, the same word was misspelled in the same way, letters transposed in perfect symmetry. A coincidence of spelling might be expected once, but not across 5 separate men, all claiming to have written their wishes in private. The estate disputes never reached resolution. None of the men died in the decade that followed, and their properties lingered in limbo, half claimed, half contested, as though the act of naming the ward had stripped them of ordinary succession. When at last the records were revisited, the 5 wills remained intact, each bearing the same unbroken hand, each insisting upon the same heir. 5 fathers, 1 silence, and no lawful way to determine whose voice had truly spoken. The transcripts of the Glenfirth probate hearings are held in a county archive, their pages brittle but still legible, bound in the thick cloth covers used in the mid-19th century. Among the petitions for livestock disputes and boundary corrections lies an entry that does not read like law at all. It describes the appearance of a boy, small for his supposed age, brought before the magistrate as the contested ward of 5 separate estates. His name is absent, listed only as the youth in question. Witnesses describe him as pale, quiet, and unmoving, answering no questions and resisting no commands. The clerk notes with a detached hand, mute, behaviorally neutral. The estates had each submitted wills naming him as dependent and beneficiary, a tangle of claims that could not be reconciled. When pressed to declare his guardian, the child offered nothing. Not a word, not even a gesture beyond a slow blink when the magistrate addressed him directly. The silence unnerved those assembled. Courts of the period were accustomed to orphans, to the stammer of frightened children, or the defiance of those unwilling to be bound to one household. But this boy gave neither. He simply sat, hands folded in his lap, his eyes cast between the magistrate and the wall. In the margins of the transcript appear notes that do not belong to the official record. Written in a tight shorthand, perhaps the private hand of the clerk, the phrases seem less observation than commentary. One line reads, "Not a bastard," another, "Not an heir," and beneath those, as though underlined in thought, "Not divisible." The words stand apart from the legal script, smaller, sharper, as if added while glancing nervously at the boy who would not answer. The magistrate eventually declared the matter unresolved, noting that no estate could prove sole guardianship and that the youth himself offered no testimony nor resistance. His presence was entered into the record as if he were property rather than person. Custody deferred. Status undefined. The child was escorted from the chamber by 2 men whose names do not appear elsewhere in the proceedings. Later, readers of the transcript remarked on the uncanny symmetry between the child's silence and the contradictions of the court. 5 fathers but none, a ward but not an heir. A presence in the room but no identity on the page. The shorthand in the margins may never have been meant for public eyes, yet it lingers there, stark and unsettling. Not a bastard, not an heir, not divisible. The boy left no sound in the chamber, but the record bears witness to a silence that unsettled the very language of the law. By the census of 1881, Glenfirth no longer existed, at least not in the way a village should. Enumerators passing through the district found roads still mapped, fields still enclosed by stone walls, and cottages still standing, their chimneys leaning into the wind. Yet, in the official census, every household line that once bore names and ages was reduced to a single word written in firm, unwavering script: relocated. The word repeats across column after column, as if stamped rather than written. It does not appear in any other parish in the county returns that year. What is most disturbing is that the land itself did not vanish. Title deeds still recorded the parcels as active, taxes assessed their value, and yet no tenant names filled the rolls. Where the names of the 5 men of Glenfirth should have carried forward, blank spaces took their place. Later annotations in red pencil add only, "no response." Inspectors sent to verify habitation described smoke curling from a few chimneys, tools left near hedgerows and doors ajar, but no occupants within. The census logbooks contain the uneasy note: structures occupied, residents absent. Maps of the county reprinted in 1882 still mark Glenfirth by name, though a faint cross is drawn beside the symbol for the parish church, denoting ruin. Within a decade, the cartographers dropped the village entirely, smoothing the valley into unbroken farmland, though no deeds recorded its sale or consolidation. The church that once kept its register of baptisms and burials was struck from diocesan lists without explanation, the word extinct scrawled in the margin beside its entry. What survives are only scraps of testimony, letters written by travelers who passed through in the late 1870s. One describes walking into the parish at dusk and hearing children's voices from a field, though none were visible. Another speaks of windows glimmering with lamplight, but doors that opened to empty rooms. These accounts were dismissed at the time as exaggeration, yet they mirror the census entries too precisely to ignore. When county archivists attempted to reconcile the absence decades later, they found no resettlement notices. Families, supposedly relocated, appear nowhere else in the census. No baptisms, no marriages, no deaths are recorded for them after 1880. It is as though the inhabitants were transcribed out of existence, the word relocated serving as both explanation and erasure. The fields of Glenfirth still bore crops, the stone cottages still cast shadows, but the people were gone, and in their place, the record holds only silence disguised as bureaucratic certainty. The parish had been written away, leaving behind land without lineage, homes without heirs, and a void that no census afterward would ever attempt to fill. In the archives of the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, among case files of fevers and failed surgeries, lies a single entry that does not fit with the rest. It is dated 1903, the year experimental serology was first being attempted in British hospitals. The subject is unnamed, recorded only as youth, Glenfirth origin, though the parish had not appeared on census rolls for more than 20 years. The doctor's notes are sparse but unsettling. A sample of blood was drawn for cross-matching experiments, part of a study comparing cellular reactions to known types. Instead of settling into a pattern, the sample divided into 5 distinct behaviors, each mirroring the markers of separate family lines. The physician wrote the observation in a hand that slanted toward disbelief. Cells replicate 5 lines of descent simultaneously, unsuitable for classification. No description is given of how the youth came to the infirmary, only that he was delivered for study and consented without expression. Nurses later described him as small, quiet, and unresponsive. His eyes open, but never fixed on any person in the ward. Attempts to question him produced no reply. He ate little, slept irregularly, and was often found sitting upright in bed, hands clasped in his lap as though waiting for instruction. The attending physician noted that his skin was unusually pale and cool to the touch, though he showed no signs of fever or illness. The blood itself seemed to resist classification. When mixed with standard reagents, it formed not one clot, but 5 faint rings, distinct yet inseparable. When spun in a centrifuge, the layers refused to separate fully, blending and recoiling into one another like threads drawn too tightly. The doctor circled his conclusion twice in ink, unsuitable. No further attempts were made to type the blood. The sample was sealed in a glass tube, waxed at both ends, and placed in storage for later examination. That tube was never seen again. Inventory records from the infirmary listed as present in 1904, then absent by the next audit. The shelf where it was meant to sit shows a gap between 2 numbered specimens, and a faint annotation penciled into the catalog reads only, "Missing." No investigation followed. Hospitals at the time often lost samples to neglect or reuse, yet the disappearance of this one was noted in a different hand, almost apologetic, as though the absence itself had been expected. What remains is the single page of notes, the sketch of the vial with its 5 lines radiating outward, and the word, unsuitable, written with such finality that it reads less like science and more like resignation. The youth is not mentioned again in the infirmary records. His blood, like his presence, slipped from the archive, leaving behind only the troubling suggestion that dissent can multiply without division, and that some subjects resist the very categories meant to contain them. The Ledger of Street. Bartholomew's School in Yorkshire is a thick, ink-blotted book that records the steady rhythm of 19th-century education. Children entered, children withdrew, fees paid, lessons attended. Amid the careful lists of pupils, one entry from 1907 interrupts the pattern. In the column for the child's name, nothing is written. A faint dash, then a smudge of graphite as though someone had meant to fill it later but never did. In the column for age, rather than a number, the teacher has written a single word, between. No attempt is made to clarify between what and what. For 2 weeks, this nameless pupil was marked as present each day. The attendance check is precise, the small tick in ink carried across 10 consecutive mornings. The notes beside the entry, however, are unlike any other in the roster. Where most children are described by temperament, distracted, diligent, unruly, this one is described only by absence. Does not speak, does not eat, but appears daily seated. The phrase is repeated almost verbatim on 3 different days, as though the teacher could think of no other way to account for him. Other pupils remembered him only faintly when asked years later in interviews with county inspectors. One recalled a boy who was always already at his desk when the class arrived, his hands folded, his eyes directed toward the blackboard though no lesson had yet begun. Another remembered watching him during lunch breaks. He would open his satchel, remove a book, and hold it open without turning a page, never touching the food placed before him. The bread remained intact, the apple polished but uneaten, yet the scraps always disappeared by the following morning, with no one ever seeing him carry them away. The headmaster's log mentions a visit from 2 men at the end of the 2nd week. They did not give names, but signed the withdrawal line with unfamiliar initials. The entry reads only, "Withdrawn by guardians." The dash where his name should have been remains untouched, the column left unfilled. In the withdrawal section, the reason is listed as unsuitable placement, though no detail follows. The roster continues without pause. The next line belongs to another boy, complete with name, age, and fee. But the blank entry hovers there, a presence on the page that refuses to close. The penciled dash has darkened over time, as if the paper itself absorbed the years differently in that space. Teachers who reviewed the old book in later decades admitted the entry unsettled them more than any record of truancy or misbehavior. A pupil without a name, an age suspended between numbers, a body that occupied a desk yet consumed nothing. 2 weeks in the history of a school otherwise ordinary, yet enough to leave a silence that persists in the ledger long after every other child's handwriting has faded. In 1924, a group of parish scholars began the slow work of reviewing genealogical charts for the Glenfirth region, a project intended to restore order to records damaged by time, fire, and war. What they expected were missing lines, faint names, or errors of transcription. What they found instead were trees that folded back on themselves, like drawings sketched in circles rather than branches. 5 distinct surnames, Jones, Price, Llewellyn, Harris, Owen, appeared again and again, but instead of extending outward into marriages, children, and grandchildren, the lines curved back, merging into the same central figure. No matter how the clerks copied or recalculated, the pattern refused to change. At first, the scholars suspected simple duplication. Parish registers were notorious for repetition, one clerk copying the work of another without checking. But when they compared the originals against certified copies, the problem deepened. The handwriting in each was consistent, the ink properly aged, and the margins filled with cross-references that bore the mark of careful oversight. No one had mistaken one child for another. No one had written the wrong date. Each entry seemed authentic, yet all 5 surnames collapsed into a single ward. One tree shows a Harris child born of a Price mother, but the father's name circles back to Jones. Another lists an Owen girl, yet her grandparents on both sides trace to Llewellyn. The lines converge and return, as if the families were not families at all, but a closed system endlessly recycling names. The scholars argued over whether this was clerical incompetence or something more troubling. They noted that the ink on certain entries resisted fading, and that when pressed under glass the paper seemed indented twice, as though someone had written over the same name again years later. The report compiled that year did not dismiss the findings. Instead, it included a cautious statement. Records are internally consistent, but genealogical expansion not observed. Lines appear authentic, yet fold inward. The wording is peculiar, almost apologetic, as if the scholars wished to distance themselves from the implication. No corrective notes were issued. The family lines remained filed exactly as they appeared, bound into county archives where researchers would continue to puzzle over them. In later decades, genealogists attempting to chart Glenfirth ancestry found themselves circling endlessly, each branch leading back to the same 5 names, the same silent convergence. What should have been the expansion of lineage became a closed loop, impossible to escape. It was not error, the clerks insisted. The documents were authentic. Yet in the record books of Glenfirth, heritage itself seemed to collapse, not into many, but into one. In 1927, during the cataloguing of a solicitor's estate in Leeds, a photograph surfaced that should never have existed. It was a simple tintype mounted on card, the kind produced 60 years earlier in small London studios. At first, it drew no special attention. Only when compared to the known Glenfirth image from 1867 did its significance become clear. The boy in the chair, his hands folded, his gaze averted just slightly from the lens, every detail matched. The faint mole beneath the cheekbone, the crease running diagonally across the collar of his shirt, even the scuff on the edge of his shoe captured in the lower corner. Side by side, the 2 photographs are indistinguishable, not similar, but identical. Photographers of the period produced copies by reprinting from glass negatives, but tintypes carried no such capacity. Each was a direct exposure, a unique object, impossible to duplicate without placing the subject again before the camera. Yet the 1927 discovery bore no sign of being a reproduction. Its plate metal was authentic, its emulsion intact, and chemical analysis decades later confirmed what the eye already suspected. The image carried none of the breakdown that should have come with time. Where the 1867 tintype should have darkened and spotted with rust, It remained sharp. Where the 1,927 plate should have shown freshness, it revealed no trace of having been recently developed. Both plates existed as if sealed against decay, trapped outside the expected arc of chemical aging. The solicitor's papers offered no explanation. The photograph was filed among insurance policies and land receipts with no annotation as to its origin. A penciled note on the envelope read only "boy," followed by a set of initials that matched no one in the firm. When the image was tested under magnification, archivists observed that the reflective surface seemed to resist examination. The boy's eyes, which should have revealed the telltale grain of 19th-century exposure, remained too clear, too present, as though printed over the photograph rather than within it. Researchers attempted to prove it a copy through duplication artifacts. They found none. No rephotographing halo, no second-generation blur. Negative testing revealed an even stranger result. When both plates were exposed to degradation experiments, neither shifted. One darkened momentarily, then cleared again, as though the image were correcting itself. Notes from the laboratory state with blunt unease. Not a copy, not aged, same plate. The presence of two identical tintypes 60 years apart defies the logic of photography, yet both remain archived, preserved in separate collections, united only by the boy who should have changed but never did. Each time the photographs resurface, the conclusion grows harder to escape. The image does not record him, it sustains him. The civil registry for 1893 in North Riding contains a page that archivists have returned to again and again, not because of its completeness, but because of its impossible duplication. In the thick, slanted script of the registrar, 3 consecutive entries list marriages solemnized on the same day. Each entry names a different bride: Margaret Ellis, Sarah Whitcomb, and Lydia Haynes, all from neighboring parishes. Yet in the column for groom, the same designation appears each time. No surname, no birth year, only the word Ward, followed by a dash. The descriptions are otherwise exact. The same church, the same date, the same witnesses noted in shorthand initials. It is as though 3 ceremonies had been conducted in parallel, overlapping on the page. The anomaly did not go unchallenged. At some later date, the entries were struck through in red pencil, a color not used elsewhere in the volume. Across the margin, in smaller, tighter script, is written the judgment that has puzzled generations of record keepers: void, he is not divisible. The phrase suggests more than clerical correction. It reads as though the registrar were commenting on the subject himself, not on the legality of the marriages. Parish investigators attempted to verify the ceremonies. None of the brides appeared in subsequent census records as married to the mysterious groom. Margaret Ellis is listed in 1901 still in her father's household, unmarried. Sarah Whitcomb vanishes from county rolls altogether. Lydia Haynes emigrates 2 years later to Canada, her passenger manifest marking her status as single. It is as if the ceremonies had been rehearsed but never consummated, written but never lived. The witnesses are no easier to trace. Their initials do not match any known parishioners, nor do they recur in any other volume. Some researchers have suggested they were fabricated, a clerk's invention to fill the empty lines. Yet the handwriting of the signatures differs subtly from the registrar's main hand, suggesting more than one participant. The marginalia has resisted interpretation. Why phrase the correction in terms of indivisibility? Why not simply strike the names and note error? Linguists who have examined the phrase note the unusual form. Not legalistic, not bureaucratic, but declarative, as though recording a property of the groom himself. The 3 entries remain preserved in the registry, their red lines faded but still visible. They stand as a curious testament to a moment in which the record attempted to multiply a figure who, by whatever rule governed his existence, refused to be split. 3 brides marked, 3 ceremonies inscribed, but only one groom who could not be divided, and so the page remains suspended between possibility and erasure. The wartime census of 1916 was meant to be exhaustive. Every man of eligible age across Britain was to be recorded, examined, and categorized for service. The lists from Glenfirth, though the village itself had long since vanished from maps, were compiled by county officials determined to leave no gaps. The names of farmers, mill hands, and laborers from surrounding hamlets all appear in order, each marked with the familiar notations of fitness or exemption. Yet, in the column where one more name should have stood, a single phrase interrupts the pattern: exempt, unaligned. The wording is unlike any other in the census. Exemptions were granted on grounds of ill health, essential occupation, or conscientious objection, each carefully coded with letters and numbers. Unaligned does not exist in any key. It is written not in the registrar's careful hand, but in a hurried scrawl, darker than the rest, as if the ink had been pressed too firmly into the page. Archivists who examined the document later remarked that the phrase seemed to bleed through the paper more deeply than surrounding entries, as though inscribed with deliberate force. No birthdate, no residence, no occupation accompanies the phrase. The column that should note parish of origin is left blank, but the line remains intact, refusing to vanish. Where other omissions were crossed out or left unused, this entry persists, demanding recognition even as it withholds identity. The clerk responsible left no marginal explanation, only the word itself, unaligned. Inquiries made after the war produced nothing. The Ministry of Records found no individual by that designation, no man who applied for exemption under such a category. When census auditors attempted to trace the omission back through earlier lists, they encountered the same silence. School rolls ended in dashes, parish registers faded into blanks, and estate ledgers recorded guardianship without names. One inspector reviewing the 1916 page remarked that the phrase seemed less an exemption than a verdict. To be unaligned was not to be spared for cause, but to be unplaceable, unable to be matched to any system of duty or belonging. The army could not claim him, the census could not classify him, and so the only solution was to invent a new term that resolved nothing. The line stands today in the National Archive, a thin scar across an otherwise orderly record of service. Every man of Glenfirth was accounted for except one, and where his name should have anchored him to history, the page instead declares him untethered. Exempt, unaligned, a phrase that both includes and erases, acknowledging his presence only by insisting he belonged nowhere at all. The surviving record from 1938 is not a full report, but a bundle of loose sheets, tucked into a folder belonging to a private laboratory in Manchester. The facility specialized in agricultural genetics, experimenting with livestock bloodlines, but among its files appears a set of notes that clearly refer to something else. On one page, underlined twice in black pencil, is the heading, Glenfirth Subject. Beneath it, the handwriting grows increasingly uneven, as if the technician himself was unsettled by what he saw. The entry begins with routine detail. A blood sample, delivered without identifying information, was tested for hereditary markers using the rudimentary serological methods available at the time. The expectation was to trace a line of descent to one or two familial groups. Instead, the technician observed something he could not categorize. Markers correspond to 5 lineages, he wrote, overlapping but not canceling. He drew a diagram of rings, 5 circles intersecting in the center but refusing to merge, each distinct yet inseparable. The sketch resembles neither standard blood typing nor Mendelian charts, but something caught between mathematics and confusion. Repeated attempts to isolate one strain failed. When reagents were added, the sample behaved unpredictably. At first, the proteins separated into bands, then recombined. A second test produced no result at all, the blood seeming to thicken and dissolve simultaneously. A third trial ended with the startling note: sample consumed itself. The vial, once containing several milliliters, was left with only a faint residue clinging to the glass. No spill was recorded, no evaporation expected. It was simply gone. The technician's later comments carry the tone of resignation rather than science. Not a mixture, he wrote. Not a contamination, 5 in 1, still present but unresolvable. The final report stamped the case as unsuitable, the same word that had appeared decades earlier in the Edinburgh Infirmary notes, echoing across generations as if the record itself knew no other way to describe him. When the laboratory's files were transferred to the archives after the war, this folder drew particular attention. Forensic examiners in the 1970s tested the remaining glass slides and found nothing, no trace of blood, no residue of protein, as if the sample had resisted even the memory of its existence. Only the notes remain, the nervous handwriting of a man who recognized that what he was observing did not belong in the categories he was trained to use. The phrase, "Five Fathers DNA," was later scribbled in the margin by an archivist, not the original technician. But the words capture what the notes imply. Descent multiplied, rather than divided. A lineage both fractured and intact. It was not error, nor contamination, nor myth. It was a sample that rewrote itself until nothing could be kept, leaving only the judgment that it was unsuitable for classification, and yet impossible to forget. In 1949, the Ministry of Health conducted a nationwide review of records related to hereditary conditions, part of a broader attempt to modernize welfare oversight in the wake of the war. During this sweep, the Glenfirth material resurfaced. What had been scattered across county offices, parish registers, probate disputes, census omissions, medical notes was pulled together under a single heading and reviewed by a committee of clerks and archivists. Their findings were never published, but the surviving memos reveal why the files did not return to circulation. The documents were sealed under a newly coined regulation, the Anomalous Kinship Clause. The clause had no precedent. It did not appear in any existing statute, nor in the ministry's legal glossary. It was inserted into the file as a rubber stamp, its lettering heavy and precise, as if cut for this one purpose. The phrase effectively removed the Glenfirth records from ordinary genealogical use. To access them required not only departmental clearance but an additional signature from a medical officer, though none were ever known to grant it. Archivists who handled the papers during the review noted phenomena that unsettled them more than the content itself. On multiple occasions, signatures appeared to change on the same page between readings. One clerk recorded that a probate entry he had copied the previous week bore a different hand when he returned to it. The loops of a letter altered, the slant reversed, as though the ink had shifted overnight. Another reported that marginal notes she had not written now appeared in her own style, uncanny imitations of her hand. These observations were not published in the official report but survive in the private memoranda exchanged among staff. The ministry's solution was not to investigate but to contain. The Glenfirth papers were boxed in plain linen folders, their identifiers scrubbed from catalogs, and the entire collection shelved in a restricted vault. An internal memo dated December 12, 1949, reads simply, "No further copying, no further indexing. Keep sealed." When a junior archivist requested clarification of the term anomalous kinship clause, his supervisor replied with a single sentence, "It is language to prevent inquiry, not to invite it." Decades later, when fragments of the files leaked into local histories, the sealed stamp remained visible, stamped across parish ledgers and medical notes alike. The clause became a curiosity of its own, cited by scholars as evidence of bureaucratic unease with mysteries it could not classify. The archive itself has never reopened. Behind its locked drawers, the Glenfirth papers still carry signatures that refuse to stay still, documents that appear to rewrite themselves, and the quiet authority of a seal whose purpose was never explanation but erasure. In 1961, during a routine reorganization of county vital records, a clerk in Durham uncovered a death certificate that should have resolved the Glenfirth matter once and for all. It was clear, official, and properly stamped. Male child, estimated age 9, deceased of unknown causes, buried in an unmarked parish grave. The certificate bore a date of issue from 1883, though no burial entry from that year could be located in any churchyard ledger. The signature of the attending registrar was genuine, verified against dozens of other documents, yet the details it recorded did not align with the rest of the archive. The child listed was unnamed, his birth left blank, and in the column for parentage appeared only a dash. For a brief period, the ministry considered the case closed. The certificate offered the appearance of conclusion, proof that the enigmatic ward of Glenfirth had died young and left no further trace. But within months of its rediscovery, inconsistencies began to surface. 3 separate files, each dated decades after the supposed death, recorded the presence of a boy of identical description enrolled in schools far from one another. A grammar school in Kent lists a pupil admitted in 1904, again without a first name, age marked ambiguously as approx. 9. A convent school in Lancashire records an external boy in 1921, withdrawn after only weeks. And most disturbingly, a residential facility in Nottinghamshire filed attendance notes in 1946 for a child marked not by age but by the phrase between. Each entry was accompanied by brief teacher annotations describing him as silent, pale, and ever present, the same language that had haunted earlier ledgers. The contradiction was undeniable. How could a child officially declared dead in 1883 appear in registers spanning more than 60 years? The ministry's internal correspondence betrays unease. One letter to the chief registrar admits that the death record does not resolve the anomaly, rather it compounds it. Another, more curt, recommends that the certificate be filed under non-essential duplication, bureaucratic shorthand for ignoring the problem. Yet, archivists tasked with reconciling the records could not overlook the fact that the same mole beneath the cheekbone, the same height and description, and the same lack of speech persisted across every file. By the late 1960s, historians referring to the case began calling it the wrong death certificate, a phrase that stuck even in official margins. The document remains preserved, but beside it in red ink is scrawled a note that does not match the registrar's hand. Not concluded. The certificate records a death, but the archive itself continues to insist upon a life unended, written and rewritten in schools decades beyond the grave. In the summer of 1975, a postgraduate researcher at a small university in northern England claimed to have located the Glenfirth child, no longer a boy in years but still appearing as one. The researcher's notes describe a meeting arranged through an anonymous intermediary, held in a rented room above a disused railway office. He brought with him a standard cassette recorder, a new model at the time, hoping to preserve what he believed would be the first spoken testimony of the figure whose presence haunted more than a century of ledgers. The encounter, however, produced something stranger than silence. The tape was recovered later from the researcher's belongings, labeled only Interview Glenfirth. The spool is intact, its magnetic strip unbroken, yet every attempt to play it results in the same outcome. No voice emerges, no ambient noise of chairs or footsteps, no shuffle of papers, only an intermittent clicking sound that punctuates the empty track at uneven intervals. When slowed, the clicks resemble the rhythm of eyelids opening and closing. Several technicians who analyzed the tape in the months after its discovery described the sound as measured blinking. The clicks fall into repeating patterns 3, 5, 7 before pausing, as though communicating in a sequence no one could decode. The researcher, whose name was later withheld from published reports, filed a single-page account with his supervisor. In it, he writes that the subject sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the machine. He insisted that the tape captured what he himself had heard during the session. No speech, no breath, no incidental noise, only the faint creak of eyelids and the oppressive sense of being observed. He blinked as though counting, the researcher noted, and the recorder obeyed. 2 days after submitting this statement, he resigned from his position and left the university entirely. His resignation letter contained only one sentence: "I will not pursue a subject who refuses time." Attempts to contact him in the years that followed produced little. Neighbors recalled he moved abroad, perhaps to Canada, though no record of employment or residence has been confirmed. The tape remains in storage, its casing worn but uncorrupted. Every effort to digitize it has produced the same blank track with clicks intact, unaffected by format or equipment. Sound engineers admit that the noise does not match any known mechanical fault, nor does it resemble the hum or static of magnetic decay. It persists like a heartbeat in metal, a rhythm without breath. The interview that should have offered answers delivered, instead, a silence that documented itself, a recording of absence marked only by blinking counted into permanence. In 1998, as part of a nationwide initiative to digitize fragile parish ledgers, the Glenfirth records were once again pulled from storage. The project used high-resolution scanners designed to capture ink bleed and paper grain, preserving centuries-old documents for online access. For most parishes, the process was routine. Names appeared where expected, pages followed in sequence, and digital files matched their paper originals. But with Glenfirth, archivists began to notice something impossible. Each time the same baptismal register was scanned and reopened, the entry for the unnamed child did not remain fixed. On one attempt, it appeared beneath the year 1812, in the space where infant had always been written. On the next, it surfaced in 1815, squeezed between unrelated baptisms. Later still, the record shifted backward, appearing in 1809, though no trace of it could be found on the original paper page when checked by hand. Technicians assumed at first it was a software error, a misalignment of metadata. Yet reboots, new equipment, and fresh scans all produced the same result. The child's record was never absent, it was always there but never in the same place twice. More troubling, the entry itself altered subtly. Sometimes the column for father listed the 5 names in sequence. Other times only 3 appeared, or 4, or an unrecognizable surname no one could trace. The ink color shifted too, sepia on one file, black on another, as though rewritten each time it was called up. One archivist, keeping a handwritten log beside the workstation, recorded 27 variations in the span of a single week. She underlined one in particular, a version of the record in which the marginal note, once all claimed, had become none claimed. Disturbed, she compared it against the paper ledger again. The physical page remained unchanged, still infant, still 5 fathers, still the familiar hand. Only the digital ghost moved. The project supervisors ordered the Glenfirth files set aside, labeled incomplete. But one archivist, lingering over the documents, scrawled a final note in the margin of his working copy before resigning. The ink was faint, his script tight, as though he meant it only for himself. 5 fathers wrote him, but none could end him. Still processing. The phrase echoes the language of computers, yet it fits uneasily against the centuries of records that came before. Today, the digitized Glenfirth collection remains inaccessible, locked behind a corrupted index. Attempts to retrieve it return only error codes repeating in endless loops. The entry does not disappear, it simply refuses to settle. Each opening writes him again, as though the child never belonged to one line, one family, or even one time, but instead to the act of being rendered, perpetually unfinished, forever present in the system that tries and fails to close his file.